What if I told you there is a question you were never meant to ask? What was buried beneath the Rutherford estate in Providence, long before America declared its independence? A place where children's laughter was never heard, but muffled cries bled through the stone floors at night. Where oil lamps burned in silence long after the household had gone to sleep. And where a locked door, deep in the earth, was said to hold Providence's most shameful secret. Why was this horror erased from church records? Why were neighbors silenced? And why, after centuries, does the very name Rutherford still stir unease among the few who know the truth? Because what happened in that basement in 1762 was never meant to be spoken aloud, and once you hear it, you may understand why. In the year 1762, Providence was not yet the bustling city it would one day become. It was a settlement balanced uneasily between wilderness and civilization, its cobblestone streets pressed into the earth by cartwheels and the boots of merchants returning from the docks. The air carried the tang of salt water drifting in from Narragansett Bay, mixed with the thick, damp smell of freshly cut timber. Houses stood close together along the main roads, their chimneys coughing smoke into the cold spring sky, while further out, on the fringes of the town, estates rose with a quiet pride. Their stone foundations meant to outlast the men who built them. It was a place caught between two worlds, the old Puritan severity that still shadowed its churches, and the ambitions of a merchant class that looked eagerly to the future. Yet beneath this appearance of progress and order, Providence carried with it the same fears and superstitions that clung to every colonial town. Whispers of witchcraft, dread of the devil's work, and unease toward those who stood too far apart from the rest. The year itself was one of transition. Across the Atlantic, Britain was straining under the cost of wars, and colonies like Rhode Island were both loyal subjects and restless children, eager for independence but wary of the price. Providence was not immune to these tensions. Ships from every corner of the Atlantic arrived at its wharves, carrying not just goods but rumors, of uprisings in distant lands, of storms that swallowed entire fleets, of strange illnesses carried by sailors who did not survive long enough to explain. And while the leaders of the town debated taxes and trade, the ordinary people were preoccupied with matters closer to home, failed harvests, the danger of disease, and the ever-present possibility that some unseen darkness lurked among them, hiding behind the shutters of a neighbor's house. It was in this unsettled year that the Rutherford family came into sharp focus. They were not newcomers. Their roots in Providence reached back nearly half a century, and their wealth was not a matter of chance. Nathaniel Rutherford had made his fortune in trade, timber, molasses, and, it was said in hushed voices, dealings less respectable that crossed the moral lines of even that permissive port. Yet in 1762, all that mattered was the gleaming brick of his estate on the edge of town, a house so large it seemed a fortress compared to the modest wooden dwellings of those around it. Its size was a statement. The Rutherfords were here to stay, and they intended to cast a long shadow over Providence's future. But what set 1762 apart is not simply the existence of that family or their house. It is the way the year became entangled with a sense of dread, as if Providence itself was resisting something hidden within its borders. Those who wrote diaries that year noted unusual storms, heavy rains that flooded cellars, and a sickness that spread among livestock without explanation. In the town square, talk was of strange dreams and voices carried by the wind. These were the kinds of events people remembered later, once they knew what had been discovered in the Rutherford home. As if the town itself had been warning them all along, the Rutherford estate was not a place people approached lightly, even before tragedy forced its secrets into the open. Visitors spoke of the silence there, a silence so complete it felt intentional. The gardens were well kept, but no children were seen playing among them. Curtains remained drawn long after the sun rose, and at night, while other homes glowed with firelight, the Rutherford windows burned late into the small hours, long after the rest of Providence had gone dark. If anyone asked what business kept the family awake, Nathaniel offered vague answers about trade ledgers and correspondence. Yet among themselves, the townspeople admitted they did not believe him. The year 1762 became the pivot point, because it was then that Providence's whispered unease hardened into fear. Neighbors began to notice things they could no longer dismiss. The faint sound of footsteps on stone when the air was still, the flicker of lanterns in the lowest windows, and the heavy, damp smell that clung to the property after rain. Some swore they heard voices, high-pitched, indistinct, and sometimes singing. It was not the singing of children at play, nor the measured hymns of Sunday worship, but something stranger, a rhythm that unsettled rather than soothed. Few admitted this openly for fear of ridicule, but many kept their distance, even crossing the road rather than walk before the estate. At the same time, the social world of Providence was turning inward. A single scandal could ruin a family, and while wealth bought silence, it did not erase suspicion. To the town's leaders, the Rutherfords were both a source of pride and embarrassment. Pride because their estate was a symbol of prosperity. Embarrassment because their odd habits and the rumors surrounding their children did not align with the image Providence wished to present to the wider colonies. It is here that the year 1762 becomes essential. It was the point at which Providence's desire to appear orderly and respectable collided with the impossibility of keeping the Rutherford secret contained. The very air of that year seemed heavy, as if the town lived under a constant storm that never fully broke. Preachers warned of the devil moving unseen among them, and their words carried more weight than usual. Some townsfolk muttered about curses, about sins carried down through bloodlines, about the dangers of building a fortune too quickly and too proudly. The Rutherfords, with their grand home and hidden children, fit neatly into these whispered explanations. Yet few were brave enough to voice them aloud. To accuse a wealthy man of consorting with darkness was dangerous. To accuse his family was unthinkable, and so Providence lived in a kind of uneasy denial, each person aware that something was wrong, but each choosing silence over confrontation. This was the mood of 1762, a collective dread, unspoken but shared. It is what makes the year so vital to understanding the horror that followed. Without this atmosphere of whispered fears, of strange weather, of sickness and shadows, the discovery in the Rutherford basement might have been dismissed as the madness of a single family. Instead, it became something larger, something that seemed to confirm every suspicion the town had tried to bury. The year 1762, then, is not just a date in a ledger. It is the year Providence itself seemed to pause, as if holding its breath, waiting for a truth too terrible to be concealed forever. The Rutherford family had carved a reputation in Providence that seemed untouchable. They were the sort of household that drew nods of respect from fellow merchants, whispers of envy from lesser families, and the silent admiration of those who passed their grand estate from a distance. Nathaniel Rutherford, the patriarch, was the visible face of that success, a man who moved through the marketplace with a quiet confidence, his boots polished, his coat cut from the finest imported wool, his speech measured and deliberate. His presence alone demanded attention. When he spoke in the town meeting, others listened, even if they disagreed. He represented wealth, stability, and lineage, and in a colony where families still measured their worth in generations, such things carried immense weight. Yet to understand the Rutherfords is to realize that their power came not only from trade, but from a carefully maintained image. Nathaniel had built his fortune on the sea, investing in ships that traveled the triangular routes between the colonies, the Caribbean, and England. Molasses, rum, lumber, and whispers of darker cargoes all moved under his name. His ledgers were precise, but the rumors were louder. Some said his wealth was accelerated by contracts that others refused to touch, dealings that crossed moral boundaries. But Providence was a town hungry for growth, and many were willing to overlook questions as long as his coin flowed freely into the community. The Rutherford estate reflected this ambition. Rising from the edge of town, it was not merely a house but a statement. Constructed of brick at a time when most neighbors still dwelled in timber, it loomed 3 stories high with a broad staircase leading to a polished oak door. The windows gleamed with imported glass panes, expensive luxuries that caught the sunlight and made the structure appear watchful, almost alive. Behind it stretched orchards, gardens, and a stone wall that marked the boundaries of the family's land. For many in Providence, the house was a reminder that some men seemed destined for greatness, while others remained bound to modest trades and struggling farms. Within the house, Nathaniel's authority extended seamlessly. His wife Margaret was known as a woman of striking composure, though seldom seen outside of formal gatherings. She carried herself with the grace of someone accustomed to being watched, yet her eyes betrayed a guarded quality, as if she lived beneath an invisible weight. To acquaintances, she was polite but distant, a figure who could exchange pleasantries at the church steps without ever allowing true familiarity. Servants spoke cautiously of her, rarely describing her moods, only noting her insistence on order and silence within the home. But it was the children who drew the greatest curiosity. The Rutherfords had only two, twin daughters, born under circumstances that were said to unsettle even the midwife who delivered them. Abigail and Eliza were rarely seen after infancy, and when they did appear in public, it was only fleetingly. The town remembered them as delicate, almost ghost-like in appearance. Their identical faces seemed carved from the same pale stone, framed by hair so dark it seemed to swallow light. Yet it was not their beauty or their frailty that people remembered most. It was their strangeness. Their movements were too synchronized, their gazes too piercing. Some swore the girls spoke little, and when they did, their voices carried an uncanny harmony, as if they were echoes of one another. Nathaniel explained their absence by citing poor health. He claimed the twins were vulnerable to the damp air, prone to fevers, and better kept indoors. Most families might have allowed their daughters to be seen in the yard at least, but the Rutherford girls were kept firmly behind walls. Their absence fed speculation. Children whispered that they had seen pale faces watching from the upper windows. Market women claimed to hear faint singing carried on the night breeze. Others swore the girls walked the halls at odd hours, their candlelight casting strange shadows against the glass. Whether these tales were true or not, they built a reputation around the twins that blurred the line between curiosity and fear. Inside Providence society, however, such matters were spoken of carefully. The Rutherfords were not a family to be casually maligned. Their wealth gave them influence, and their name held weight in matters of trade and law. Yet even influence has its limits when secrecy breeds suspicion. Over time, the townspeople began to sense that something within the family was askew. Nathaniel's demeanor grew more severe, his temper sharpened, and his once sociable presence in taverns and gatherings diminished. Margaret, once the quiet but steady hostess, became reclusive. Servants were dismissed abruptly, replaced by others who seldom remained long. Each change fueled gossip, though no one dared confront the family directly. The Rutherford household operated with a rhythm all its own, one that set it apart from the life of the town. Lanterns burned late into the night, casting faint light from the windows while neighbors slept. Deliveries were made at unusual hours, sometimes in secrecy, with crates carried directly to the cellar rather than the kitchens. The estate became a place of questions rather than answers, a home whose grandeur no longer inspired admiration but unease. People began to avoid walking too close to its gates, preferring to take longer routes rather than risk feeling the unseen eyes from within. Even among those who benefited from Rutherford wealth, a quiet uneasiness lingered. Ministers noticed that Nathaniel and Margaret attended services less frequently, excusing themselves with matters of business or health. When they did appear, the twins were never with them, and whispers passed through the pews about why children so rarely joined their parents in worship. To a community steeped in religion, absence from church was not simply neglectful, it was suspicious. And in an age when whispers of witchcraft still clung to New England like smoke, suspicion was a dangerous thing. Despite all of this, the Rutherfords remained untouchable for one reason: they were indispensable. Their wealth helped fund the town's growth, their ships carried goods vital to trade, and their estate stood as a symbol of prosperity at a time when Providence sought recognition beyond its borders. To accuse them of wrongdoing without proof would have been unthinkable. Thus, the family existed in a strange balance, admired publicly, feared privately, and tolerated because of the advantages they provided. It was a balance that would hold until events made silence impossible. In 1762, the tension surrounding the Rutherford family reached its breaking point. Neighbors who once whispered idly about odd behaviors began to speak in darker tones. Strange noises were reported at night: shuffling, faint cries, sometimes a sound like singing rising from the earth itself. When the rains came heavy that year, a foul odor spread from the Rutherford property, carried on the damp air. Some said it smelled of rot, others of iron. And though Nathaniel continued his work and maintained his composure, the weight of secrecy within his household grew heavier, pressing against the carefully constructed facade of wealth and respectability. It was within this house, behind its polished brick and shuttered windows, that the true character of the Rutherford family revealed itself, not through their wealth or influence, but through the unspoken shadow that lingered in every corridor, every glance, every word left unsaid. The twins, Abigail and Eliza Rutherford, were the most haunting element of the family's story, the part that seemed to unnerve even those who dared not speak of them aloud. From the very beginning, their arrival was wrapped in unease. The midwife who assisted Margaret Rutherford during the difficult birth was said to have left Providence not long afterward, abandoning her trade and moving inland where no one could question her. People wondered if she had seen something she could not reconcile, something she could not carry in silence. Whispers suggested she described the infants as unnatural, though what she meant by that was never clear. Those who recalled her mutterings claimed she had spoken not of deformity, but of a presence. A strangeness in the room the night the girls were born. Abigail and Eliza grew. But unlike other children of Providence, they never seemed to grow into the community. From infancy, they were kept apart, hidden behind the tall brick walls of the Rutherford estate. Neighbors seldom saw them except by accident, a pale face caught in the upstairs window, a flicker of movement in the garden when dusk made it hard to discern detail. Even these brief sightings left strong impressions. People described the children as strikingly identical, so much so that it was nearly impossible to tell them apart. Their skin was almost translucent, veins visible beneath. Their eyes an unnatural darkness that seemed to linger on whoever dared look too long. In a town where most children spent their days outdoors, fetching water, chasing each other in the fields, or running errands through the square, the Rutherford twins' absence stood out like a void. The excuse of poor health explained little, for rarely were they seen even walking the grounds of their own estate. Their seclusion became an object of fascination among the townsfolk, especially the younger generation who invented stories to account for it. Children whispered that the girls had been cursed at birth, that one carried the spirit of the other inside her body, or that they had been switched with changelings left by witches in the night. These stories circulated like wildfire, for children often sense the fears adults try to hide. When the twins were glimpsed, their behavior only deepened the sense of wrongness. They rarely spoke, and when they did, it was said their voices rose in perfect unison, as though one thought could not exist without the other. Servants claimed to have overheard them conversing in a strange manner, not speaking to one another but speaking together, finishing each other's sentences without hesitation, as if their thoughts were not separate at all. Some whispered that they sometimes spoke in a language no one recognized, syllables that carried the cadence of a chant. It was their gaze that unsettled people most. The girls had a way of watching without blinking, their identical eyes fixed so intently it was as if they were studying something invisible in the air around a person rather than the person themselves. On more than one occasion, visitors to the Rutherford home claimed that while one twin appeared to look at them directly, the other seemed to look through them as though her sight extended beyond the walls and into some unseen space. It created the unnerving impression that they were not merely observing but searching for something. As they aged, their isolation deepened. By the time they reached 10, they were almost never seen outside the estate. Rumors spread that they had become nocturnal, walking the halls of the house at night with candles, their shadows stretched long against the walls. A delivery boy swore he saw them standing barefoot in the mud near the cellar door one morning at dawn, their hands clasped, their faces turned toward the earth as though listening to it. When he mentioned it in the market, others claimed they too had glimpsed strange activity at the Rutherford property at odd hours. The strangest tales, however, came from sound. Neighbors who lived close enough to the estate sometimes spoke of hearing faint noises carried on the night air. It was not uncommon in Providence to hear crying infants, arguing families, or the bark of dogs after dark. But the sounds from the Rutherford house were different. They were said to be rhythmic, patterned, like chanting or song. Some described it as two voices weaving together, beginning softly before rising in intensity, only to stop abruptly as though silenced by command. Others said they heard laughter, high-pitched and echoing, yet always cut short, leaving a silence that felt even heavier than the noise. The townspeople tried to explain it. Some said Nathaniel Rutherford, with his wealth and education, might have been teaching the girls unusual recitations, perhaps prayers or passages from books beyond common reach. Others suggested the twins were sickly and prone to delirium, their voices carrying in ways that unsettled the imagination. But beneath these rationalizations lingered unease, the kind that grows heavier with repetition. When the same strange sounds were reported again and again, when children whispered of pale faces in the windows, and when servants quietly resigned after only weeks of service, the image of the twins hardened into something more than gossip. There were those who believed the twins themselves were not entirely human. The thought was rarely spoken outright, but it simmered beneath the surface of conversations. In a town still close to its Puritan roots, the possibility of the unnatural was never far from mind. To be born different was to invite suspicion. To be born twins identical in a way that seemed to erase individuality was unsettling enough. But to carry with it the whispers of chanting, unblinking stares, and midnight wanderings that crossed into the territory of fear. The family's attempts to shield Abigail and Eliza only fed this perception. Rather than draw the girls into society to prove them ordinary, the Rutherfords doubled down on secrecy. Their absence from church was noted with unease, their absence from gatherings even more so. In Providence, church attendance was both duty and spectacle, a way to show belonging. The twins' absence was read not as necessity, but as deliberate concealment. Each time Margaret appeared without them, stiff and unreadable, the absence became more glaring. Each time Nathaniel brushed away questions with a practiced smile, the doubts grew sharper. By 1762, the twins had become less children than shadows in the minds of the townspeople, phantoms that embodied their deepest unease. Were they victims of some unspoken illness? Were they kept hidden out of shame or out of fear of what they might reveal? Or was something more sinister at play within the Rutherford walls? Something tied to the unnatural way in which the girls seemed bound to each other. What everyone knew was this: the twins were central to the Rutherford mystery. Their silence, their strangeness, their seclusion, these were not details to be dismissed as eccentricities. They were warnings, signs that something within the family had turned inward and dark. And as the months of that year passed, Providence could not help but wonder whether the unease they felt when they whispered the names Abigail and Eliza was not simply rumor, but a recognition of a truth too dangerous to confront. Beneath the Rutherford estate lay the cellar that came to define the family's legend, though at the time it was spoken of only in whispers, half-truths, and nervous glances toward the shuttered windows of that great brick house. Every dwelling in Providence had a basement or a root cellar of some kind. They were practical necessities, stone-lined chambers where food was kept cool, where barrels of cider aged, where salted meat and root vegetables were preserved against the long winters. But the Rutherford basement was not spoken of in practical terms. It was a place sealed off, locked, and avoided, a part of the house that seemed to repel rather than sustain life. The entrance itself stood at the rear of the estate, beneath a sloping stretch of earth where the orchard began. A heavy oak door, reinforced with iron bands, barred the descent. Unlike most cellars, which opened with little more than a wooden latch, this one was bolted with locks of uncommon size, each hinge thick and blackened with age. Men who delivered barrels to the Rutherford property spoke of how strange it was to see such measures taken for something so ordinary. One carter, after being waved away from the door by Nathaniel himself, later muttered in the tavern that the locks were not meant to keep thieves out, but to keep something in. The stairs leading down were narrow and steep, descending into a chill that seemed to rise up from the ground itself. Those who later entered described the air as heavy, carrying a dampness that clung to skin and clothes alike. The walls were not like the smooth, neatly set stones of most basements in Providence. They were rough, jagged in places, as though carved in haste from the earth and then left unfinished. Faint etchings could be seen along the stone, though whether they were marks left by tools or something carved deliberately by human hands, no one could say with certainty. Some swore the shapes resembled symbols, though others dismissed them as nothing more than scratches made by rodents or the shifting of stone over time. What unsettled people most was the sound, or rather, the absence of it. When the cellar door shut, the world above seemed to vanish. The house, the orchards, the town, all disappeared into silence so deep it pressed against the ears. Even the faint creak of wood and the muffled voices that usually seep into underground chambers were absent here. It was a silence that felt deliberate, as though the place had been built to swallow noise, to erase it. Those who experienced it said it was not like being alone in a room, but like being buried. Strange reports circulated long before the cellar was opened to outsiders. Servants who carried goods down the steps often complained of a foul odor that came and went with the weather. On rainy nights, the stench was strongest, metallic, like rust or blood, mixed with the sweetness of decay. Some said it was the smell of spoiled food or stagnant water, but others whispered darker explanations. When asked, Nathaniel Rutherford was curt. He claimed the cellar was where supplies for his ships were stored, where salted provisions and spare cargo waited for transport. Yet no one saw these barrels leave the estate. What neighbors noticed most was the light. At odd hours, lanterns flickered through the cracks of the cellar windows, glowing faintly against the ground outside. This was unusual, for no family had reason to work below their house at midnight. The flickers came irregularly, sometimes in bursts as though someone paced with the light in hand, sometimes steady as if the lantern had been set down for hours. A boy once dared to crawl close to the foundation at night, peering through the narrow opening where light escaped. He swore he saw two figures standing barefoot on the stone floor, their hands linked, their faces turned upward as though listening to someone unseen above them. His friends laughed at the tale, but he never approached the Rutherford property again. The cellar also carried a reputation for sound. Those who lived nearest claimed that, on still nights, faint noises rose from beneath the earth. They were not the ordinary creaks of a house settling or the scurry of animals in the dark. They were voices, soft and melodic, rising and falling in a pattern too deliberate to be mistaken for accident. Sometimes it was singing, other times chanting, always in harmony as though two speakers shared the same breath. These sounds were never acknowledged by the family. When neighbors asked politely about them, Nathaniel offered cold smiles and dismissive answers, his tone carrying enough weight to end further inquiry. Some believed the cellar was not merely a place of storage, but of confinement. The heavy locks, the faint cries, the lanterns burning long after the rest of the house slept, all fed this suspicion. A merchant's apprentice once delivered a crate to the estate and lingered at the door longer than he should have. He later told companions that he heard a thin, desperate knocking from beneath the boards, as though someone far below had pressed their fists against stone. When he mentioned it aloud, his master silenced him with a stern warning. Such talk could ruin reputations and invite danger. The boy never repeated the story again, but the rumor survived without him. Over time, the cellar became less a physical place than a symbol of the family's hidden life. The house above was pristine, its windows polished, its gardens neatly trimmed. But beneath, people imagined horrors that grew with every retelling. The twins, always hidden from view, were said to spend their days in the dark beneath the earth. Brought up only rarely, their pale faces a reflection of the shadows they lived in. Some claimed Nathaniel kept them there for their protection, others that he feared what they might do if allowed to roam free. Still others suggested that the twins themselves demanded it, that they preferred the silence below to the world above. By 1762, the cellar's reputation had reached a breaking point. The air of secrecy no longer felt like eccentricity but menace. Neighbors avoided passing too close, and children dared each other to shout toward the locked door from the safety of the road. Servants left the household in growing numbers, some refusing to speak of what they had witnessed below. The more the family tried to contain the mystery, the more it spread, until the very word Rutherford carried a weight that silenced conversation. The cellar was never meant to be spoken of in detail, not then, not later. It was the part of the house that lived in the imagination of the town, a place where light and sound seemed to twist into something unnatural, where locks served not as protection but as warning. And though no one could prove what lay within, everyone understood the same truth. Whatever was kept in that basement, it was not meant for the eyes of Providence. The winter of 1762 in Providence was remembered not only for its biting winds and relentless snow, but for the whispers that seemed to grow louder with each passing week. By this time, the townspeople had already begun to avoid the Rutherford property, crossing the road rather than walking past the house, muttering prayers under their breath when forced to pass its looming frame. It wasn't the kind of fear born from a sudden tragedy, nor was it tied to anything concrete the authorities had discovered. Instead, it was something heavier, more insidious, a spreading unease that the house itself carried a weight too dark to speak aloud. The events in that basement had left scars deeper than any physical wound. They had planted something into the collective consciousness of the community, something that refused to fade. The silence surrounding the Rutherford basement became its own form of violence. People would not speak of it in daylight, but behind closed doors, lanterns burning low, families told each other stories, whispered theories of what had happened, each version more grotesque than the last. Some swore the house was cursed, that whatever evil had begun in that basement had seeped into the walls and the earth beneath, staining everything that touched it. Others believed the land itself was poisoned, that the Rutherfords had disturbed something ancient, something that punished their family with horror beyond imagination. But there was a third belief, darker and harder to dismiss, that the true horror was man-made, born not from curses or restless spirits, but from secrets so abhorrent the town could never fully confront them. The twins, barely remembered as boys anymore, became mythological in the retellings. They were said to have been seen moving in the basement windows long after they were supposed to be gone. A flicker of movement behind glass covered in frost, a shadow shifting when no one should have been there. A neighbor swore that one winter's night she had heard the sound of children weeping carried on the wind from that house. When she crossed herself and ran inside, slamming her shutters against the storm, she insisted the crying had followed her, pressing against her door like the wail of something both human and not. No one dared check for themselves because everyone feared the same thing, that the basement had not kept its secrets buried as tightly as the town had hoped. What made it worse was that no one really knew what had been found when the authorities finally entered that basement. The men who went inside emerged pale and silent, refusing to describe what they had seen, muttering only that some things are best left to the dark. But Providence was not a large town, and secrets do not remain sealed forever. One man's wife claimed that her husband had come home trembling, unable to eat for days, his hands shaking as though he had touched something unholy. Another whispered that what had been discovered could not be spoken of because it implicated not only the Rutherfords but others, people of influence whose reputations would collapse if the truth came to light. The silence became less about protecting the dead and more about preserving the living. The horror was not just in what had happened in that basement, but in the choice to keep it hidden, leaving the rest of the town to grapple with shadows rather than facts. And yet, even without certainty, the horror endured. Children who grew up hearing fragments of the tale avoided the Rutherford property for decades. Some claimed the land itself groaned when walked upon, as though it resented intrusion. Travelers who did not know better sometimes tried to camp nearby, only to leave before dawn, shaken by the sense of being watched, of whispers in the wind that grew clearer the longer they ignored them. These stories, exaggerated or not, fueled the mythology, turning the Rutherfords' tragedy into something larger, something that haunted Providence as much as it did the family's name. What disturbed the townspeople most, however, was not just the memory of the basement, but the lingering idea of complicity. If the Rutherfords had truly done something unspeakable, how many neighbors had looked away? How many had heard noises at night and decided not to investigate? How many had noticed the boys vanishing from public view long before the truth was uncovered? These questions hung in the air unspoken, but they festered in the hearts of those who lived closest to the property. The guilt of silence mirrored the basement's silence. Both became prisons from which Providence never fully escaped. As years passed, new families moved into the town, and yet the Rutherford story always surfaced. Parents used it as a cautionary tale, warning children against wandering too far from home or prying into places they weren't meant to see. Ministers invoked it as proof of what happens when faith falters, painting the twins' fate as divine retribution against a family that had strayed from God's light. But even these attempts to rationalize or moralize the events never erased the unease. If anything, they deepened it, reminding each new generation that there had been something so monstrous beneath their feet that no one dared name it outright. The house itself eventually decayed, abandoned and overtaken by weeds, its frame collapsing slowly under the weight of time. Yet no one rebuilt there, no one farmed the soil, and no one claimed it after the Rutherford line ended. The property became a void in the town, a physical absence that drew as much attention as it repelled. The basement, though filled with rubble and ice, was said to still exist, a hollow chamber beneath the earth that refused to collapse entirely, as if the ground itself would not close around what had happened there. And so Providence learned to live with the silence, not because it was comfortable, but because it was easier than naming what had been hidden. But silence does not erase memory. Every time another winter storm swept through the town and howled against the empty property, people were reminded of the twins. Every time a child swore they heard crying in the wind, or when someone passing by after dusk felt the unmistakable weight of unseen eyes, the past returned. The horror was not confined to the basement. It had seeped into Providence itself, reshaping the way the town saw itself. What was buried was not just the remains of two children. It was the evidence of how far human cruelty can go when no one dares to intervene. The Rutherford basement remained closed off to daylight, but in the minds of the people, it was always there, a dark hollow at the heart of Providence, whispering truths no one wanted to hear. And though time moved on, though new buildings rose and the revolution itself would soon reshape the world, that one house, that one family, and that one unspeakable basement continued to rot in memory, a wound the town could never fully stitch closed. The silence, in the end, was its own kind of scream, one that echoed long after the snow had buried the Rutherford home and all who had once walked its halls. When the Rutherford house finally stood empty, its shutters rattling in the wind and its foundation groaning as though the earth itself resented the weight it carried, the stories did not end. They multiplied. In Providence, silence became fertile ground for rumor, and rumor soon transformed into legend. The people who had once crossed the road to avoid the Rutherford property began whispering about it in taverns, around fireplaces, and even at church, unable to resist the magnetic pull of the mystery. Yet what struck outsiders most was how the tone of these whispers always carried the same edge: fear, not curiosity. There were houses in town where tragedies had occurred before, fires, deaths, fevers, but none of those homes were treated the way the Rutherford place was. None of them felt alive in their emptiness. By the late 1760s, Providence had learned to live with the Rutherford story in the same way a body lives with a scar, ignoring it by day, haunted by it in quiet hours. Some claimed that in the deepest of winter, when the snow pressed against the windows and the town seemed smothered under white silence, the cries of children still drifted from the abandoned property. Others swore that lantern lights appeared in the basement windows long after the house had been shuttered, faint glimmers that vanished if you tried to draw too close. Parents told their children not to linger near the property, but the warnings only made the daring ones braver, sneaking up to the edge of the Rutherford land on moonless nights, pressing their ears to the ground in hopes of hearing something stir beneath the soil. Some returned pale and shaken, swearing they had heard faint scratching, as though something below was still trying to claw its way out. The basement itself became a symbol. Though its door was nailed shut and later reinforced with heavy boards, townspeople spoke of it as if it were still breathing. The way the ground dipped slightly around the house gave the impression of a throat swallowing, and the stones of the foundation, slick with moss, looked like something festering rather than something built. Even as the structure above decayed, collapsing into itself, the basement endured, stubbornly resisting time, as though it wanted to keep its secrets intact. People said the earth would not reclaim it because the earth rejected what it held. This idea spread like wildfire, especially among those with a superstitious bent, who insisted that stepping too close to the Rutherford ruins was inviting contamination of the soul. Still, Providence could not completely turn away. If the site had truly been avoided, its legend might have faded. Instead, the town grew addicted to its own fear. Stories of the Rutherford twins seeped into sermons, where preachers warned that sin festers in silence and draws the devil to feed. Children dared each other to run up and touch the boards nailed across the basement door, sometimes scratching their initials into the wood as proof of courage. Drunkards in the tavern boasted of spending a night near the ruins, though few ever managed to stay past midnight, claiming that a sudden chill always fell, even in the heat of summer, as if the air itself recoiled from the ground. The basement became a stage for the imagination, a hollow space that each generation filled with its own version of the horror. Not all of the whispers leaned toward the supernatural. Some older residents, especially those who had known the Rutherfords personally, muttered darker, more human explanations. They suggested that what was hidden in that basement had less to do with curses or restless spirits and more to do with cruelty, secrets, and shame. They believed that silence had been enforced because if the truth had spread, it would have implicated not just the Rutherford family but others in Providence who had allowed things to happen under their noses. The horror, then, was not just in the basement. It was in the complicity of neighbors who heard things at night and said nothing, who noticed the twins' absence and asked no questions, who valued their comfort more than justice. This interpretation, whispered though it was, cut deeper than the ghost stories, for it accused the town itself of guilt. As the decades passed, new generations who never knew the Rutherfords firsthand inherited the stories. The twins became less like children in memory and more like symbols, pale figures with hollow eyes who wandered the ruins in search of release. A chilling rhyme emerged, passed among children, half a nursery chant and half a curse, warning that if you listened too closely outside the basement door, the twins would hear you, and they would not forgive you. Some claimed to see them at the edge of the woods on fog-heavy mornings, standing hand in hand, watching silently. Others said that if you dreamed of the Rutherford twins, it was a warning that something buried in your own life was about to surface. The ruins became a place of pilgrimage for the daring and the desperate alike. A few people even claimed the site held power, that making an offering there could grant wishes, though never without a price. Coins, trinkets, and even crude dolls were sometimes found scattered near the foundation. No one admitted to leaving them, yet no one doubted their purpose. In this way, the legend of the Rutherford basement began to take on a life of its own, evolving beyond the tragedy of two boys into something mythic. It was no longer just a story of a family's downfall. It was Providence's own reminder that some truths were too terrible to bury, that silence does not smother horror but amplifies it. And still, the most unsettling part of the entire story remained the lack of resolution. The people of Providence could build new homes, start new lives, and bury their dead, but they could never bury the basement. It was always there, lurking at the edge of town, rotting but unbroken. Travelers who heard the stories often dismissed them as provincial superstition until they stood before the ruins themselves and felt the air turn colder, the silence heavier, as if the place itself demanded recognition. The horror of the Rutherford twins endured not because of what people knew, but because of what they could never quite know. The human mind cannot leave unanswered questions alone, and so it filled the void with fear, guilt, and dread, weaving the twins into the very fabric of Providence's history. In time, the Rutherfords' name all but disappeared from official records, but the story survived in the mouths of the living. To the people of Providence, the basement remained a reminder of how quickly darkness could fester when no one dared to confront it, how silence can grow heavier than any scream. The townspeople never truly spoke aloud what they feared most, that perhaps the horror in that basement was not confined to the past, and that by ignoring it, they had allowed it to take root in the soil itself, ready to surface again when the silence finally cracked. By the turn of the century, the Rutherford ruins had become something more than an abandoned property. They were a shadow across Providence itself, shaping the town's collective memory in ways no one openly admitted. The basement, rotting but intact, was no longer just a place where two boys had met their end. It had become a symbol of what the town feared most, that evil could fester quietly in the homes of the respectable, and that neighbors could turn their heads and pretend not to see. This was what gave the legend its staying power. Unlike other ghost stories, which might fade when retold too many times, the Rutherford tale kept its bite because it was inseparable from the community's own guilt. Every retelling, every whispered rumor carried a trace of accusation. Parents warned children to behave or, "The twins will hear you." But beneath the jest was a reminder that Providence had failed its most vulnerable. The older generation, those who had lived through 1762 and beyond, often fell silent when the subject arose, their eyes shifting, their mouths pressing thin. The younger ones, who never knew the Rutherfords but inherited the story, found themselves haunted by questions they could not answer. If the basement had been a place of unspeakable acts, why was the house not burned to the ground? Why had the town chosen silence over justice? These unspoken questions made the tale more powerful than any official record ever could. The basement became the perfect vessel for memory because it resisted closure. Graves could be blessed, houses could be torn down, but the hollow chamber remained, like an open wound. And people filled it, not with facts, since few were ever known, but with their own fears. Some saw it as a den of supernatural torment, others as the hidden crime scene of a town complicit in cruelty. Each generation reshaped the meaning, but none escaped its weight. The silence itself became a kind of inheritance, passed down like a family heirloom, a reminder that Providence was built on more than timber and stone. It was also built on the things it had chosen to ignore. For some, the legend was a mirror. In times of hardship, when famine struck or disease spread, whispers about the Rutherfords returned with renewed force. It was said that calamities struck because the truth had never been cleansed, that Providence carried a curse as long as the basement remained. Ministers capitalized on these fears, weaving the tale into sermons as a cautionary example of what happens when a community tolerates sin and secrecy. Their voices thundered through wooden chapels, insisting that God's judgment lingered over the town, that the cries from the basement were not merely human, but warnings from the Almighty. These sermons gave the story a kind of spiritual authority, embedding it not only in memory but in doctrine. But there was also another side to it, less about faith and more about control. Elders used the story to remind the younger generation of their place, to keep them obedient. "Do not pry where you should not, or you'll end up like the Rutherford twins," became a refrain. In this way, the basement horror was weaponized as a form of social order. It was not only a cautionary tale of cruelty, but also a tool to suppress curiosity, to keep people from questioning the silences around them. And yet, ironically, this repression only deepened the fascination. The forbidden nature of the story made it irresistible. Children dared each other to approach the ruins. Young men tested their courage by carving marks into the basement door, and travelers sought it out as if touching its silence would prove their bravery. Each act of rebellion kept the legend alive. Still, beneath the whispers, there remained the gnawing suspicion that Providence itself bore responsibility. Over time, families left the town, unable to shake the feeling that they lived under a shadow. Others doubled down, dismissing the stories as childish nonsense while secretly avoiding the ruins themselves. Even the bravest rarely lingered there at night. And those who did often left with stories that spread quickly through taverns and farmhouses, a candle that blew out without wind, footsteps in the snow that began at the foundation but led nowhere, the faint sound of scratching beneath the earth, as if something was always waiting to be unearthed. These details changed from mouth to mouth, but they always returned to the same idea, that silence cannot bury the past. In many ways, the Rutherford basement became a story about Providence's soul. It was no longer only about two boys who vanished into darkness. It was about what a town will tolerate to keep itself comfortable. The silence had not been chosen to protect the innocent. It had been chosen to protect the reputations of the powerful, to avoid scandal, to keep life moving. That choice lingered like a rot, shaping the way Providence saw itself. Every new whisper was a reminder that the town had failed, not just once but continually, by refusing to confront the truth head-on. The basement, in that sense, was less a haunted chamber than a mirror of the town's cowardice. As generations passed, the story of the Rutherfords no longer needed names or dates. It became timeless, stripped of specifics, told as though it had always been there. Travelers wrote about the strange unease of Providence, about how its people carried a heaviness in their speech, about the ruined property that locals refused to discuss directly. The basement had transformed from a place into an idea, an embodiment of how the past clings to the present when unspoken. It became proof that silence is never neutral. Silence itself is an act, one that binds the guilty and the innocent alike in chains of dread. And so, the horror endured. Long after the Rutherfords' bloodline ended, long after the revolution reshaped the land and Providence grew into something larger, the basement remained. Not simply in stone and soil, but in memory, in culture, in whispers that could not be silenced. It became a story about survival, not of the twins, but of the secret itself. A story that showed how darkness thrives not only in basements, but in the spaces left unspoken, in the gaps where truth should be but never is. The Rutherfords' legacy was not the ruin of a family, but the haunting of a town that had chosen silence over confrontation, and discovered too late that silence can echo louder than any scream. In the shadows of history, stories like the one you've just heard remind us that the past is never truly buried. It lingers, waiting to be uncovered. The tale of the Rutherford twins isn't just about a basement in Providence. It's about silence, complicity, and the unsettling truth that darkness thrives when no one dares to confront it. These stories force us to look closer, to ask the questions others were too afraid to ask, and to see how easily the most horrific secrets can hide in plain sight. If this story made you feel that chill crawl up your spine, if it left you wondering how many other horrors are hidden in the forgotten corners of history, then you're exactly the kind of seeker this channel was created for. We dig deep into the forbidden, the unspeakable, and the eerie truths that were meant to stay buried. Every week we uncover more forgotten chapters, peeling back the silence that once protected them. So if you want more of these dark historical stories, tales of mystery, crime, and secrets that whisper through time, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next descent into the shadows, and I want to hear from you. What do you think really happened in that basement? Was it something supernatural, or something far more human and terrifying? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice keeps these stories alive. Stay curious, stay watchful, and never stop asking the questions no one else will.